Hello everyone, this is Rick. Welcome to an episode where we will discuss how the Britishers expanded their domination in India. We are going to see their process of exploiting the Indian resources through deindustrialization, revenue policies, and different forest acts. So, this video is going to be a long one and it is catered according to the ISC syllabus of class 11. However, anyone interested in this topic, especially the aspirants of competitive exams, can go through this video. Please carry a notebook with you so that you can note down the important points. And the last part of this video contains the questions and their answers, which will help you in your exams. So let's start with deindustrialization, revenue, and forests. British revenue policy and deindustrialization. European trade and wealth drain. So, European countries or European companies traded in handicrafts, cotton, and silk in Mughal India. After the Battle of Plassey, a serious drain of wealth began. So, after the Battle of Plassey, there was drain of wealth, but before that Europeans always conducted business on the context of handicrafts, cotton and silk. So that was plain business. Drain of wealth started after the Battle of Plassey. From 1760, England's Industrial Revolution created a surplus of machine-made goods. England needed India's market for these goods. So Battle of Plassey happened in 1757, 23rd June 1757. So after that, a lot of wealth from Bengal were being transported to England, and thus just a few years later, from 1760, England was able to fund its industrial revolution, where a lot of goods were being made at a very short period of time. Such amount of goods that they had to sell it in other areas. All could not be used by themselves. Hence, it was a surplus of machine made goods. And where will they sell it? They will sell it in Indian markets. Lancashire and Manchester merchants lobbied Parliament to ban Indian cotton and silk imports, ending the company's trade monopoly. So, East India Company was taking a lot of Indian cotton and silk to Britain, and because of that, the local manufacturers of cotton and silk from Lancashire and Manchester, they were having huge loss. So they lobbied the parliament and banned Indian cotton and silk imports. Thus, East India Company lost their monopoly of cotton and silk import from India. Excise duties and market closure. Indian materials faced heavy excise duties. In 1797, calico import duty was 18%. In 1824, it rose to 67.5%. So almost three times. Now, when I say in our last point, we have said that there was a ban in Indian cotton and silk imports. Now, ban does not mean that you cannot carry those products into England. It simply means that taxes will be increased in such an amount that you will not want to carry those products into the European market. So the tax in 1797 was about 18%, but in 1824 it rose about 67.5%. Sugar duty and European blockade. So import duty on Indian sugar was raised thrice. Napoleon's continental blockade further ruined India's European trade. So Indians basically could not sell their products in European markets because of high import duty. Means to for the Britain to sell Indian products, the Indians had to pay high amount of tax to Britain. British demands from the Chamber of Commerce. Demands included ending companies' monopoly, opening Indian trade to private English merchants, reducing machine import duty, and improving transport. So these were the demands of the Britishers, where it was not only East India Company who could trade with India. The Britishers wanted all British companies to have equal facilities while trading with India. Charter Act of 1813 ended companies' monopoly. Act of 1833 increased exploitation and reduced customs on British imports. So, if you want to buy something from Britain, then the Britishers will not have to pay any tax to have the Indian market. But if Indians try to have the British markets, then they will have to pay higher import duties. Collapse of Indian economy and handicrafts. So how did Indian economy collapse and what was its effect on the local handicraft industry? So with no export avenues and local markets, flooded by British goods, poverty rose, agriculture and industry suffered. So Indians could not export their products outside, and all the local markets were flooded by British goods. So Indian business was on a downfall, and thus there was rise in poverty. Agriculture and industry both suffered. Weavers and artisans turned to land cultivation, old towns turned into ruins. Dhaka's industry faced decline. So when there was no profit in industries, no profit in business, that time all the workers of factories, mainly weavers and artisans, they transported their professionalism into the villages. So they became agriculturalists, they became farmers, they became peasants. So old industrial towns were totally vacant. In 1801, muslin investment in Dhaka was reduced. By 1814, investment in Bengal muslin was totally stopped. So muslin was a kind of luxury silk item from Bengal, and muslin had its demand all over the world. However, since the demand of muslin was very high, the Britishers were not having a profit in their local items. Therefore, in order to have their own trade profitable, they destroyed the muslin industry in India. And so the Bengal muslin investment totally stopped by 1815. In 1813, 21,361 houses in Dhaka paid Chowkidari tax. Chowkidari tax means night guard tax. So from this we can understand how many houses were there in Dhaka in 1813. That was 21,361. And by 1830, just like 17 years later, it dropped to 10,708 houses. So the population of Dhaka was reduced more than half. Governor Verelist's report. So Governor Verelist noted that severe scarcity of weavers has left many has left their professions. So he was the governor who noted that many weavers have left their professions. British imports to India were taxed at 2.5%, while Indian goods faced increasing duties, ruining local production. So if something from Britain was imposed were imported to India, then they were taxed only 2.5%. While if something Indian was to enter Britain, then they would have to pay higher increasing duties. And thus Indian industry suffered while Britain industry used India as a market. British machine made clothes dominated the Indian market, making native production uncompetitive. So, Indian native market or Indian native industries couldn't compete with the machine-made goods of Britain. British capitalism and Indian economy. So how was British capitalism and what was the situation of Indian economy because of British capitalism? So India came under complete monopoly of British traders exploited for British capital investment. So India was a land of profit for the Britishers and Indians were totally exploited. Huge English capital was invested in plantations, industries, and railways in India. So, England businessmen invested, or England companies, they invested huge amount of money in plantations, industries, and construction of railways. East India Company switched from handicrafts to raw material exports like cotton, silk, saltpeter, tobacco, and sugarcane. So these were the things in which East India Company traded in. Mainly, they took raw materials from India, they manufactured in Britain, and then again sold it in India itself with much higher price. India was reduced to feed England's industrial needs with raw materials instead of finished goods. So England was having industrial revolution and India was the supplier of raw materials instead of finished goods, which could have given the Indians a bit more profit. Revenue collected from India by the company was siphoned to England under the head home charge. So whenever huge amount of revenue was collected from the Indians, a portion of it was sent to England under the context of home charge. Now this was direct siphoning. Indirect siphoning was also there in the form of paying salaries to the British officials and many other ways. So the export-oriented economy led to a sharp fall in domestic crafts and industries. So this export-oriented economy, why? Because Indians were basically exporters of raw materials to Britain, and that led to total downfall of domestic industries. India's economy was reduced to a supplier of raw materials and a market of British goods. So we supplied raw materials to the British goods and Britishers made things with those raw materials and again sold it to India. So we were a land of supplier of raw materials and market for British goods. Revenue policies and the need for permanent settlement. Now, what is permanent settlement and how was the revenue policies of the time? Revenue policies means tax extraction methods from the Indians. So pre-British land revenue. How was the land revenue calculated before the coming of the Britishers? So revenue varied from 1/6 to 1/3 of the produce. Cultivators kept land if they paid regularly. So if the cultivators paid their revenues regularly, no one could take their land and the revenue was very like nominal and it was like 1/6 to 1/3 of the produce depending upon the land you cultivated in. So after Diwani means tax collection rights. The Britishers got tax collection rights of Bengal in 1765. So company treated the land as estates and tried to maximize revenue after the grant of Diwani. So company treated the land as estates and tried to extract as much money as possible in the form of revenue after they got Diwani rights of Bengal. Warren Hastings introduced a 5-year lease with highest bidders, later restored annual settlements due to failure. So Warren Hastings used to give a plot of land to an individual for about 5 years, one who could give most tax to the Britishers. But later on, they resorted to annual uh, annual giving of a plot to the owner to a leaseholder for who would be the highest bidder. Manchester merchants lobbied to cut import duties. Revenue was raised by taxing cultivators. Land became a commodity. So Manchester merchants, the merchants in Manchester in England, they lobbied to cut import duties, and thus East India Company was at a loss. So in order to cover up that loss, in order to make up for that loss, revenue was raised in India and land became a commodity of extraction. The 1770 Bengal famine killed one third of the population. Farming to the highest bidder increased exploitation. So the 1770 Bengal famine almost killed 33% of the Bengal population, and the tension increased more when Britishers gave the land to the highest bidder. Due to corruption and failure, home authorities authorized Cornwallis to devise a permanent settlement plan. Now they needed to have a proper plan to extract resources or to exploit the revenue policies in India. And so Cornwallis was called upon to devise a permanent settlement plan. Cornwallis implemented the permanent settlement on 22nd March 1793, replacing the farming system. So those 1 year or 5 year lease system was abolished and Cornwallis developed the permanent settlement plan. Key features of permanent settlement. Now, what were the main provisions of the permanent settlement? Zamindari ownerships. Zamindars got hereditary land ownership and could sell, mortgage, or gift land. So, zamindars were the owners of land, and after zamindars, who would become the owners of land? Their sons. So, zamindars got hereditary land ownership and they could do virtually whatever they wanted with the land. Revenue had to be paid regularly. Default led to land auction under sunset law. So revenue by the zamindar had to be paid regularly, and if the zamindar could not pay the revenue on the declared date before sunset, if the revenue did not reach to the office of the Britishers, then according to sunset law, again his land will be auctioned and given to the highest bidder. Revenue payable to the authority was fixed permanently based on 1789 to 1790 rates. 90% went to the company and 10% to the zamindars. So 90% of the collected revenue basically went to the company and 10% was for the zamindars. Initially introduced in Bengal and Bihar, it extended to 19% of British India, including Orissa, Benares, UP, and North Carnatic. So these were the areas in which permanent settlement of revenue collection was introduced. It was mainly in eastern India. Fifth report by Faringer called it a successful step that ended uncertainty and brought confidence. So Faringer published a report and called this system to be a very successful step. Company received fixed revenue. Cultivators now knew their landlord, reducing confusion in tax payments. So according to company's view, according to the government, what are the benefits they got? So there was a fixed revenue. No matter what the situation was, every year the company would get the money, and cultivators were now giving the money to the zamindars whom they personally knew. So there would be a feeling of goodwill among the zamindars and the cultivators. So thus, according to the government, there was a reduction in confusion. Cornwallis hoped zamindars would invest in agriculture, irrigation, and grant riots permanent rights. So Cornwallis had expected that because of this system, since the zamindars are taking over the land for a very long period of time, so they will definitely invest for the wellness of the people, and they will also improve the irrigational facilities, and after some time they would give the land permanently to the riots or the farmers. But what happened actually? Failure and consequences of permanent settlement. So how did this permanent settlement fail? Sad blunder by Cornwallis. Cornwallis granted the land to zamindars, creating a parasitic landlord class living off cultivators' labor. So these landlords became the middlemen. Zamindars became the middlemen. They used to take huge amount of money as tax from the cultivators. They used to keep most of it for themselves, and little bit whatever was the fixed rate, that rate they used to give to the Britishers. So these zamindars became parasitic landlords who lived off the hard work of the cultivators. Zamindars raised land rent, extracted higher revenues, evicted tenants, and used the force or treachery. So zamindars were not at all good in maximum cases. So what did they do? Even though the tax amount was fixed, still the zamindars raised the land rent, and they took lot of money from the cultivators. The Britishers did not do anything because zamindars paid the fixed amount to the Britishers every year. So they extracted higher dues, and they considered themselves to be the judge, jury, and executioner of their plot. So they could evict tenants, and they also used treachery to extract more from the peasants. No patta, deed of right, was given to the cultivators. Regulation 8 of 1793 became ineffective. So there was Regulation 8 of the Permanent Settlement Act, and Regulation 8 stated that you will have to give rights to the cultivators, rights to be owners of their own land. But Zamindars did not give this right to the cultivators. They themselves held the ownership of the lands, and the peasants were basically tenants in their own lands, led to the growth of patnidars, dar patnidars, and parasitic groups like jotedars exploiting peasants. So peasants could not pay that much of money to the zamindars every year, and so they had to depend on money lenders who were again middlemen. So after taking money from the money lenders for a very long period of time, when the peasants could not pay them back, the their land was taken away by the moneylenders. So there rose another groups, many other groups of parasitic people who lived off exploiting the peasants. Zamindars misused revenue on luxury and ceremonies, creating the Babu culture and wasting agricultural profits. So, whatever profits the peasants had through their hard work, the Zamindars exploited them, and the money was misused. They did not use the money for the benefit of the peasants. They showed off, they did parties, and they created the Babu culture, which was the epitome of luxury for the zamindars in eastern India. While peasants suffered rent hikes, the government only got fixed amount from 1793, becoming a financial loser. So this class of zamindars were extracting a lot from the peasants, and it changed every year, it increased every year. However, every year they were giving fixed amount of money to the Britishers. So Britishers were having ultimately the greatest loss. Agricultural growth halted, cultivators suffered, and overall rural economy weakened severely. So that is how the permanent settlement failed. Next came the dietary settlement of land revenue. Now, since there were huge problems in permanent settlement, the Britishers created another settlement of land revenue called the Raitwari settlement. So the Raitwari system was implemented in southern and western India, especially after Mysore and Peshwa lands. So these were the areas where the Raitwari system was imposed, and especially when Mysore and Peshwa lands, means the Maratha lands, they got conquered by the Britishers. The Britishers devised this system of riotary settlement. Role of Captain Reed and Proclamation of 1796. So Captain Alexander Reed settled land directly with riots. In 1796, a proclamation allowed long term settlement, charging riots 50% of the estimated produce. So this was a plan devised by Captain Reed, and according to that, there will be no middlemen like zamindars of permanent settlement. The Britishers would directly collect tax from the farmers or the riots. And how much will be the tax? It will be a lot, estimating about 50% of the produce. Thomas Munro, the governor of Madras, fixed revenue at 1 by 3 of gross produce and removed intermediaries. So Thomas Munro, who was the governor of Madras, said that we will take about one third of the gross produce and it will be taken directly from the peasants. There will be no intermediary class, and riots paid directly without zamindars. Riots lacked permanent land rights. However, the riots will not be permanent owners of the land. Their settlements or the agreement of how much tax will be paid that lasted for 30 to 40 years and were revised, often with rent increases. So for 30 to 40 years, the riots or the farmers will pay tax directly to the East India Company. The authority was the landlord. However, there was legal disadvantage because even though landlords were not that powerful as they had been during the permanent settlement, still they were the authority. And in disputes, it could auction riots' property and seize cattle. So even though the Britishers said that there will be no intermediaries, but still authority of collecting tax was given to the landlords, and so the landlords could do whatever they want. In the 50% tax rate was considered exorbitant, causing riots to abandon cultivation and lands became fallow. So 50% of the tax was too much for the riots, and thus sometimes they had to abandon cultivation and the lands became empty. The exploitative system led to the Deccan riots. Ranajit Guha called it as the revitalization of landlordism. So in Deccan, people protested against the system, and famous historian Ranajit Guha had called it as a new form of landlordism. Poverty and famines under British rule. So under British rule, how were the people impacted? Mainly the negative impact happened through increase in poverty and famines. British industrial and revenue policies worsened Indian poverty. Resources were drained with little return to the people. So British industrial and revenue policies totally deteriorated the situation of the Indians because all of our resources were going out of the country. Dadabhai Nauroji in Poverty and Un-British Rule in India and Ramesh Chandra Dutt in Economic History of India exposed the impact of colonial policies. So Dadabhai Nauroji, the grand old man of India, was the first person to understand this drain theory, and he provided statistical calculations on how much money the Britishers are looting from India every year. There was also nationalist historian Ramesh Chandra Dutt who did a lot to expose the exploitative practices of the Britishers. Both authors argued that the British economic drain could not be offset by industrialization, leading to widespread poverty. So both of them said that this economic drain was the only cause for increase of poverty among the Indians. Famines broke out frequently. Orissa and Madras saw severe famines during 1865 to 66, killing over 10 lakh people. So during 1865 to 66, within 1 year, 10 lakh people died in Orissa and Madras. Western UP, Bombay, Punjab, Karnataka, and Maharashtra were repeatedly hit by famine due to British neglect. So these regions were repeatedly having famines, not because there was scarcity of production of food resources, but because it was man-made. The famine was man-made by the Britishers. Scholars like William Hunter, James Mill, and others held British policies responsible for famine outbreaks. So these were European scholars who directly told that the Britishers are responsible for these increase in poverty of the Indians. The colonial economy created chronic poverty, food insecurity, and devastation across rural India. And that did not happen before the coming of the Britishers. So the fact was, it was totally man made by the Britishers. Development of modern industries in India. Now, how did modern industries start in India, and was it at all beneficial to the Indian themselves or not? British entrepreneurs used cheap labor and raw materials of India to develop jute and cotton mills, mostly producing threads and textiles. So they used the cheap labor of India to produce jute and cotton mills, to make jute and cotton mills, the mills that will mostly produce threads and textiles, nothing of finished products. The first cotton mill was built in Bombay by Jahangir. By 1854, the first jute mill was opened in Rishra near Calcutta. Foreign capital was also investment. So this is a little history on how the first cotton mill was established in India and how the first jute mill was established in India. So both were on the eastern and western sides of India. Growth of tea, coal, and iron industries raised India's world position in jute trade. Shivsagar saw tea growth, Bihar's coal output supported industries. So, thus, every industry complemented each other. But Indians were not getting any profit because most of these resources were being exported to Britain in one form or another. The company failed to start industries in western India due to stiff resistance from Parsis who had invested capital from China and East India. So company, even though they were doing very good business in Eastern India, they could not do good business in Western India. Why? Because Western market was mainly dominated by the Parsis, and these Parsis were very good businessmen. So Maratha rule restricted British entry. Marathas were very strong even when the Britishers started conquering India. So they did not support the British industrial policies. Even post 1818, native states restricted foreign goods, merchants and entrepreneurs in western India. So Marathas or western Indian people on a whole were very nationalistic, and so they restricted the foreign business in their own territories. Western India lacked railway and saw materials like tea, jute, and coal. Transport between Bombay and interiors was poor. So Western India did not have proper railway network, and the transport between Bombay and other interior parts of Western India was almost non-existent. Parsi and Gujarati capitalists imported machines and began cotton mills in Maharashtra and Gujarat. Swadeshi movement in 1905 boosted local ownership. So from this slide, we can understand why the Britishers could not develop proper business in western part of India. It was mainly because of the nationalistic feeling of the West Indians, western part of the Indian people, and the Parsis who were dominant businessmen in the western India. Economic impact of modern industrialization. So how did modern industrialization help the Indians? What was the economic impact? So modern industries created capitalist and working classes. Earlier society was divided into landlords and peasants. Now intermediaries emerged. So there was an emerge in the middle class who were the capitalist and working classes of people. Before this, the society was mainly divided into landlords and peasants. Now we have a new sector called capitalist and working classes. New industrial centers grew, attracting rural jobless to the towns. Urban expansion increased, leading to more labor class settlements. So, these new industries people, required huge amount of labor force. So, people from the rural areas transported or migrated to the industrial sectors, and thus there was a growth in urban centers. Rapid migration created housing, sanitation, and water issue. Industrial areas saw rise of slums around factories. So sudden population increase in the urban centers gave problems of housing, sanitation, and water supply, and thus people used to live in slums around the factories. Industrialization increased wealth drain. British products replaced Indian cottage industries. Railways hurt peasants via low land compensation and ignored irrigation. So basically, even though there was industrialization, the Indians actually suffered. So British products destroyed Indian cottage industries. Railways were made by taking lands of peasants. Peasants did not receive any amount of money for that. Even if they did, it was very low, and irrigation systems were hampered. Dadabhai Nauroji in Poverty and Un-British Rule in India and Ramesh Chandra Dutt in Economic History of India exposed British exploitation. Factory workers were very poorly paid. Frequent famines during British rule claimed many lives. Leaders like William Hunter and James Mill criticized these policies. So these were the European people who themselves told that the Britishers are exploiting the Indians, and that is causing nothing but increase in poverty among the local Indian people. India became a market for British goods and lost indigenous industries, leading to poverty, joblessness, and socio-economic suffering. So India was just a resource supplier to Britain and market for the British finished products, and that led to increase in joblessness and poverty in India. Colonial forest policies and their implementation. So, how were the forests in India taken care of? We will learn through the colonial forest policies. Sacred forests in pre British India. Forests in ancient India, like God's Grove or Devaranya, were considered sacred and left untouched. Mughal rulers did not organize forest conservation. So, forests in India were treated as living entities, and they were viewed with a sacred perspective, and thus forests were mostly left untouched. Organized forest management began during British rule. The British recognized teak as valuable timber and made it a revenue source. So forests were being used by the Indians, and Indians knew how to manage forest. While on one hand they used to cut trees, they used to exploit the forest resources. On the other hand, they also used to plant trees and take care of the wild animals. So this was a system. However, when British saw that valuable timber is there in Indian forests, they made it a target to use it as a revenue source. In 1807, East India Company sanctioned teak cutting. So Indian forests, which were there for thousands of years being maintained by Indian people, was suddenly restricted to the Indians. And in 1807, Britishers sanctioned teak cutting. Whose teak? Our teak was sanctioned from us. So in 1855, Lord Dalhousie issued the first forest conservation memorandum. And what was that? German botanist Dietrich Brandis became Inspector General of Forest in 1856. He invented and classified Indian trees. So he was a German botanist who became Inspector General of Forest, and one of his main contribution was that he made a list of Indian trees and where they are commonly available. He classified the Indian trees into broad categories. So the first Forest Act in 1865 was passed under Brandis's guidance. It allowed the government to declare any land with trees as forest land, excluding private forests. No rights were given to users. So the users of the forest did not get any benefit, and wherever there were trees, the British government could literally come and say this land belongs to us. Even if you planted the tree, even if local Indians planted the trees, the Britishers could any day come and claim that area for themselves under the Forest Act of 1865. Forests were classified as reserved, protected, and village forests under the Forest Act of 1878. So in 1878, another Forest Act was passed and three separate categories of forests were given, that is reserved, protected, and village forests. Rights of people were heavily restricted to increase timber revenue. So people and their rights towards forest were not at all paid attention. The sole attention of the Britishers was to increase the revenue that they could get from timber. Then there was Land Acquisition Act of 1894. Although it was not a forest specific act, it enabled the government to forcibly acquire forest land with minimal compensation extending state power. So this was an act through which forest land could be acquired by the government with paying almost no money to the owners. Forest laws and their impact on colonial communities. So what were the forest laws and how did these laws affect the local communities? So, though meant for public purposes, the Land Acquisition Act of 1894 was used to take over forests. Critics labeled it draconian and unjust. So, this Land Acquisition Act was a method by the Britishers to take over the forest, and this was a very unjust act. The 1865 Act restricted access to forest produce, woods, and pastures. Rural customs and livelihood were disrupted by colonial law. In those days, whatever cooking and firing activities were done, they were done using woods from the forest. Now, suddenly, for after thousands of years, someone from outside, thousands of kilometers away, they are coming to India and saying that you cannot use your own forest. What will happen to the rural people then? They will be reduced to mere uh, life holders. They will not be even treated as people, and so rural customs and livelihood were disrupted with this law. Forest dwellers were declared trespassers in their own land. They faced imprisonment and fines for using natural resources. So for using their own natural resources, the people were declared as criminals. The British labeled rural forest people as destructive and backward. Now, when the rural people protested against these laws, they were termed as destructive and backward. Laws were implemented using technological and scientific pretexts. The system broke rural economy. Rights to wood collection, cattle pasturing, and forest produce were taken away, affecting survival. So the basic needs of rural people were totally ignored and taken away. And thus it was a battle for survival for the rural people. Local people protested individually and in groups. Some led revolts against the British oppression to reclaim their rights and dignity. The rural protests gained support from social reformers and urban intellectuals. So few of the intelligent educated people of the cities supported the rurals on their fight for survival, and thus the movement was intensified against the British forest policies. Now we will go through the important questions and their answers, which will not only help you in your exams, but you will also understand this chapter in a much better way. What were the opinions of James Grant and John Shore towards the proprietorship of lands in pre-British India? James Grant's view: he believed that there existed hereditary zamindars in pre-British India who acted as proprietors of land and collectors of revenue. John Shore's view: he opposed Grant's view and emphasized that zamindars were merely revenue collectors and did not have proprietary rights over land. Debate over ownership: the contrasting views reflected confusion among British officials regarding traditional Indian land tenure systems. Policy implication: this debate influenced the framing of the permanent settlement of Bengal in 1793, ultimately recognizing zamindars as land owners. Impact: it shifted land ownership patterns, displacing traditional village communities and empowering a class of royal zamindar landlords. Mention the terms and conditions on the basis of which the permanent settlement was made with the zamindars. Fixation of revenue: the land revenue was fixed permanently, meaning it would never be increased in future. Recognition of zamindars: zamindars were recognized as hereditary landowners with rights to collect rent from the peasants. Responsibility to pay: zamindars had to pay fixed revenue on time to the British government, failing which their land could be auctioned. No state intervention: the government would not interfere in the relationship between zamindars and peasants. The rights of actual cultivators or ryots were not protected under this settlement. Discuss the merits and demerits of the permanent settlement. Merits: stable revenue. Provided a stable revenue source of income to the British government. Encouraged zamindars to invest in land improvement, expecting higher returns. Reduced administrative burden as the state did not collect revenue directly from peasants. Demerits: riots suffered as zamindars often increased rent arbitrarily. The revenue was fixed, leading to financial losses for the British when agricultural production increased. Many zamindars became absentee landlords, showing little interest in land improvement. Do you think the riotary settlement was less oppressive than the permanent settlement? Under riotary settlement, the state collected revenue directly from the riots, reducing exploitation by intermediaries. Peasants were considered owners of land as long as they paid revenue. However, the revenue demand was often high and based on inaccurate surveys. The revenue was revised periodically, creating uncertainty and pressure. While it reduced the role of zamindars, the riotary system was still oppressive due to heavy state demands and lack of institutional support. Explain the causes of Indian backwardness in industry in the 19th century. Indian entrepreneurs lacked sufficient capital due to drain of wealth and lack of institutional finance. Indian artisans and industrialists had limited access to modern machinery and education. British policies favored imports from Britain and imposed high duties on Indian goods. Industrialization and cheap British products ruined local industries. Poor connectivity limited the reach of raw materials and finished products. As noted by Dadabhai Naoroji, British exploitation drained India's economic resources. Why did the native Bengalis become industrially backward and the Parsis and Gujaratis become industrially forward in Western India? Parsis and Gujaratis had extensive maritime trade links with China and East Asia. These communities had accumulated vast wealth and reinvested it into industries. Bombay was open to British merchants, while Bengal had restrictive land and social structures. Western India enjoyed relatively more stability compared to Bengal post 1857. Native Bengalis faced repression during Swadeshi movement, leading to industrial decline. Discuss the role of Lord Dalhousie in management of forests in India. Lord Dalhousie issued the first memorandum on forest conservation in 1855. He realized forests could be major source of revenue through timber extraction. Under his influence, Dietrich Brandis was appointed as the first Inspector General of Forests in 1856, initiated state control and organized forest management in India. His policies laid the foundation of the Indian Forest Act of 1865. Discuss the main features of the Forest Act of 1878. Forests were divided into reserved, protected, and village forests. Complete restriction on local usage, only the state could extract timber. Some usage allowed under state supervision. Limited rights given to villagers under strict conditions. Tribal communities lost rights to grazing, fuel collection, and wood gathering. Forest policy became a means of earning revenue for colonial rulers. Why did local people organize resistance against the Forest Acts? Communities were denied access to forest produce, grazing, and wood. Daily practices like collecting firewood became punishable offenses. Forests were central to rural livelihood. Denial led to widespread poverty. Fines and imprisonments were introduced for violations. The British labeled tribals as backward to justify forest control, included silent protests, group revolts, and armed uprisings, often supported by urban intellectuals. So that was all to know about how the Britishers deindustrialized India, exploited the Indian resources through numerous revenue policies like permanent settlement and riotary settlement. And we have also seen how modern industries grew in India, what was their impact, how Indians suffered through man-made famines, and how did the poverty increase in the Indian subcontinent. As last, we have also gone through how the forest laws totally destroyed the rural economy in India. So if you have liked the video, please show me some support so that I can bring brighter contents in future. Thank you for your love and patience.